Hi, I'm Isobel from Photo Media, and today we're going to begin to talk about light. So there's a huge number of lighting options for use in moving and still image. These options fall into two main categories, constant and flash lighting. Constant light sources are ones that are constant. They're on for the duration of your shoot. Examples include tungsten, LED, fluoro, kinoflow, etc. Traditionally, constant lights were tungsten-based incandescent bulbs. Tungsten lights are generally very warm, very bright, and super hot. They were one of the first commercially available light sources, and as such would be the commonly found domestic light source up until the advent of the LED. Tungsten was also used commercially in moving and still image applications. Early film was very slow, technology hadn't advanced to high ISO film stock yet, so lights needed to be really bright, hence tungsten was perfect and wouldn't be replaced until the turn of the 21st century with advances in LED technology meant that comparatively bright lights could be manufactured super cheaply. Tungsten-based redheads and blondies are still used occasionally, and they're great full spectrum sources of light. Eventually, film technology and faster film speeds were developed, allowing for quicker exposures, which meant that we could capture motion. This meant that our subject matter could move beyond still life objects and rigidly posed bodies. It also meant that we could start to move beyond the still image and into the moving image. Even with these faster speeds though, we still needed a whole lot of light for a good exposure. This restricted what we could shoot to what we could find outside in broad daylight. To get around this, early videographers and photographers constructed huge sets like Thomas Edison's Black Maria in order to have a plain background but enough light to adequately expose their film. This huge barn had a removable roof which acted like a lid, being able to be peeled back to allow in an abundance of sunlight to expose the subject adequately. Fast forward 100 years, and thankfully camera technology has advanced considerably, allowing us to work with much more sensitive film speeds and much less ambient light. Before we look at light sources in depth, I wanted to cover some language that we're going to use when we're talking about light. It's important that we all understand this language so we can use it to describe our intentions with lighting and be able to communicate these intentions to others to assist us with our lighting our scene or talking about our work. First up, we'll talk about the quantity of light. This is how much available light there is in a scene. Turn up your light source and this increases the quantity of available light. Turn it down and this decreases the quantity of available light. The next term is the quality of light. So this refers to the relative softness or hardness of our light sources. Generally, the smaller the light source, the harder the quality of light emitted. The larger the light source, the softer the quality of light. To give you a context, visualize being at the beach on a sunny day. You have the light source, which is the sun. You look at the beach pavilion and notice the shadow cast by the building. It's a very hard line with a really stark contrast between the shadow and highlight area. This is because our light source is a hard light source. Our light source is the sun, 150 million kilometres from you on the beach. Being that far away, it's a very small but very bright source of light. It's also completely undiffused, meaning that it's small and hard, throwing out very contrasty, hard-edged shadows on the things that it illuminates. Think now about coming back to the beach the next day when it's overcast. You look at the same pavilion and look at the shadows. They look completely different. Let's think about why. Our light source is the same. We're still being lit by the same sun at relatively the same 150 million kilometres from us. It hasn't gotten brighter or closer, but it has changed its quality. Clouds have come in between the light source, which is the sun, and the subject, which is the beach, to diffuse the light and make it softer. As such, our shadows are now much less defined, the scene much less contrasty. We have taken our small light source, the bare sun, and made it a large light source by obscuring it behind clouds, transforming the quality of this light from hard to soft. This exact same principle applies with our studio work. If we're working with a small light source, but we want a softer quality of light, we can incorporate a light shaper or a softbox, or some other sort of diffusion layer to transform that small light source into a larger one and give a softer quality of light. Similarly, we can work the other way around. If we find that our light source is too diffused or too broad, we can move it further away from our subject or scene to make the light source comparatively smaller from the point of view of your scene, to make shadow edges more defined and the image more contrasty. We also need to think about the temperature of our light sources. We'll cover this more in depth in our video on white balance, but in short, just keep in mind the temperature of the light sources that you're using and balance them and your camera accordingly. Today we're going to run through some lighting setups using our Elinchrom flash heads. These lights are called flashes because they emit a super quick flash of light, as opposed to outputting a consistent, constant source of light. Initially, working with flash heads is somewhat confusing because when you set them up and turn them on, they do emit a constant source of light. This is called our modelling lamp. Keep in mind that this light isn't the source that illuminates our images. It's just a preview of what our flash will do and how it will shape the light. Our actual light source is the comparatively much brighter flash of light that's discharged when we fire the unit. To start working with flash, we need to understand a few principles. The first is that because we're working with a flash or a burst of light, we need to think about how our exposure is different to working with constant light. In the studio with flash, we can't use any of our automatic or semi-automatic metering modes. We need to work in completely manual mode. Although this makes working out our exposure more difficult on one hand, it also makes it easier on the other. Because we can control the quantity of light around, we always work with our ideal ISO, 100. Similarly, because we're working with a flash of light, we work with a constant shutter speed, which is 1/125. This is what we call our sync speed. We can work with faster or slower shutter speeds, but this takes a little bit more understanding, which we'll talk about later on. So for now, just keep in mind that your ISO is always at 100 and your shutter speed at 1/125. This leaves only one variable on our exposure triangle, and that's aperture. However, because we've introduced an external light source, we've now got another variable to worry about, and that's the quantity of light emitted by our light source. Determining the correct exposure is balancing the intensity or the quantity of light output on our flash with the aperture on our camera. You can do this extremely accurately with a handheld light meter, which we'll talk about in another video, or you can do it by eye, which I'll demonstrate now. Generally, I'll start a shoot by thinking about what sort of depth of field I'm after. If I want a shallow depth of field, wide open aperture, it will mean that I won't need much light, so I can start with my light on low power. If I wanted a larger depth of field, like f16, I would want a lot of light, so I could stop down my aperture to get that larger depth of field. For today, we're going to work somewhere in the middle with something like f8. I'm now going to pop my camera into manual, set my exposure on 100 ISO, 1/125 shutter speed, and f8 for my aperture. Now I can move to my light. We have 4 lights which hang off our ceiling rack in the studio. I'm going to show you around the body of the flash on a floor stand to familiarise you with the respective parts before working with my light on the pantograph. So now we're going to briefly talk about shaping the quality of light with our flash units. So the advantage of working with flash is that it's very cool, and you've got the option of adding all of these light shapers directly onto the light. So in the studio, we've got a whole bunch of different light shapers. You don't need to know what each and every one is called. You just need to get a bit of an idea of kind of how they shape light. So as a rule, we know that the smaller the light source, the harder the quality of light. So if we went with a smaller light shaper, we're going to get that more contrasty light. Alternatively, if we wanted a softer quality of light or more kind of coverage, we'd go with something like a softbox that has a really large surface area that the light's coming out of. So we can have the same quantity of light. All of our flashes can be set at the same kind of power, but the quality of light is determined by these different shapers. So if you want a soft quality of light, you go with a softbox. If you wanted something more directional, go with a smaller light shaper. If you wanted something soft but also kind of structured, you'd go with something like a beauty dish. So think about the quality of light that you want in your image, and that will determine which sort of light shaper you attach to your light. So if you did want to change the light shaper on your light, we just need to make sure that we're following the outlines that I did in the induction. So to remove a light shaper, we twist this ring, this collar, so it lines up with that little white line, and then we twist off clockwise. And you'll notice that the flash unit has these two ridges near those white lines, and that's where we line up our light shaper. So if I wanted to attach this or something similar, I would line up these two gaps with those white lines, twist counterclockwise, and it will kind of click in. We want to lock in that collar and give it a little shake to make sure it's sturdy. So we are going to turn our flash on. So to do that, we just use the power button. That's going to bring up our display here. So it's a complicated little display. You don't need to understand all of it. Most important thing to notice is these big numbers. So they indicate the intensity or the quantity of light output from the flash. This dial increases that output or decreases it. Really important that if you go up or down, you discharge before you take the next shot to get rid of that previous charge of power. You can use these little arrows side to side, and they will add or take away a whole stop of light. So depending on your exposure, if you took an image and it was too bright, you would take down the intensity of your light, discharge, and then shoot. Other things to keep in mind is we essentially need to discharge and turn off in really close succession to get rid of that full charge of power. So to do that, we just push this button and then the off power really quickly. So I'll do that now.